Okay, as usual, good morning or good evening or good night, wherever and whenever you're joining us to watch this. So today I'm joined by Roel Moulder, who's from the Netherlands, and Roel is a beer historian of basically of Dutch and Belgian beers primarily. Writes a number of articles for magazines, has a blog, and has written a number of books. One of the things he has done is written basically a history of Lambic, but it's meant to be, it's the true history of Lambic, let me put it that way. Because Lambic beers, for those who don't know, are very romanticized, spontaneous beers in Brussels. And there's deliberate romanticization of the history in that. But the actual history is a lot more interesting than it's made out to be, as Roel will tell us. So, Roel, thanks a million for taking the time to come and join me tonight.
Yeah, good evening.
Good evening. So, like I said, your own background, as I said, you're a beer historian. You have a website, lostbeers.com. You've written magazine articles. Is there anything I left out there that people should know about you?
Yeah, no, you mentioned the website. Also, as you said, I've written or participated in a few books, available only in Dutch. I'm sorry. Nice occasion to start learning some Dutch, by the way.
Okay.
And I've been researching beer history for 11 years now.
Okay.
Before I also study other fields of history, but years ago I graduated in economical and social history. So I was always interested in, the history of every day, of what were normal, common people doing all day, and beer history really fits into that. Economic history, and that's why I find it so interesting.
Yeah, no, it's the same as I was telling you offline. I kind of got into just talking to brewers and that, and then suddenly you're down a rabbit hole of the history, the archaeology, and the whole. It's a way into different cultures and different histories, and it's fascinating, and it tastes good as well. So
yeah.
So let's talk about Lambic. As I said, Lambic is promoted with a very specific history, but it turns out that that's not really the history of it. But maybe before we kind of talk about how it came to be what it is, maybe we should just define what Lambic is today. There's a different number of varieties. There's different, Gueuze, Faro, Lambics, Krieks, and who's brewing them, and how are they brewing, and what different types they are, and we can kind of work backwards then to how they got to there.
Yeah, so first, of course, a disclaimer. So I live in the Netherlands, and Brussels is 1 hour and a half drive away. So I'm not the self-proclaimed expert on Lambic, and certainly not of what's happening with Lambic today. Though I do have some notions about its history. So, basically what Lambic is that it's a base beer. It's today. All the other beers you mentioned are derived from Lambic. So you don't brew a Faro or you don't brew a Gueuze. You just brew Lambic, and with that you can mix Lambics, young Lambics and old Lambics, and in the case of Kriek, of course, sour cherries. And by mixing that and also maybe adding a sweetener, sugar, you can get the other different products. So you get Gueuze, which is a rather dry variety of Lambic that today is usually in a bottle and produces a nice foam, almost like champagne in a way. But then you get Faro, which is, as Gueuze is usually yellow, as is Lambic itself. Faro may be of a slightly darker color. and is usually sweeter. So sometimes they add a sweetener, or they just add the sugar which has not fermented. So that's Faro, which is also usually slightly less in alcohol. Typical Gueuze is like 7% or so, or slightly less. For instance, the Gueuze bone that I have here, so 7%. Then you get Kriek, which is the variety, Lambic mixed with sour cherries. Those are the Lambic products that are available. And to make your base beer, to make a Lambic, you have to start, as specified by law, you have to start with at least 30% of wheat. Then you start brewing, and then a very important aspect is that you don't add any yeast.
Yeah.
So to get the stuff fermenting, the yeast has to be there in your brewery, and it has to settle into your wort to start fermenting. So where exactly this yeast is, you can say it's in the air, or it might be in the barrels, or it might be in the beams of the brewery. That is open for some discussion, also from some legends. It's not really that important. The important thing is that you never add any yeast. And one method to accomplish that is that you cool your beer on a so-called cool ship. So a large vessel, really large. It can be as large as an entire attic. So it has a large surface, and that's how it cools. Basically, that is the way that all beers were once cooled before you get refrigeration or Boulder coolers of that sort of stuff. But today, only Lambic brewers, or mostly Lambic brewers, are still doing that because it does help to get your spontaneous fermentation.
Yeah, it's a bigger surface area.
Yeah, and then another step is that usually you keep your Lambic in wooden barrels for a very long time, 1 year and a half or so. Sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, but you would basically have to ask a Lambic brewer for the exact details of how they do it today. And then, of course, to get your end products, you then start mixing, blending. You take Lambics from different barrels to get your perfect Gueuze, or your perfect Faro, or your perfect Kriek. Blending is really is an art. It's not an easy thing to do as far as I know. And today I've lost count because we've had some new Lambic brewers starting up in the past few years. For years there were about 10 Lambic brewers or so in the region around Brussels, and there were 2 in Western Flanders as well. And now lately we've seen some new ones. There are also a few enterprises that do not brew anything; they just buy their wort from a Lambic brewer, and they do their own blending. So there you also get these Lambic blenders, and they're basically really special beers that really don't really exist anywhere else in the world. So to taste them, they're very much recommended, and I think we're close to getting extinct.
Yeah, and that's maybe where we get to at some point, because that's where I suppose, like you mentioned there, that this was how all beers were brewed at one time. They were all, before people understood yeast, before anything. That's kind of the mythology that they've maintained, especially when it nearly died out in Belgium.
Yeah,
that mythology kept it going for a long time, and that's where kind of the
So basically, what I just described is how what Lambic is. But of course, you do get some stories around that, of course, they were subject of some research, not only by me but also by some other people as well, because I think they needed looking into. So you get some Lambic mythology, if you like. That was worth looking at.
Yeah, and that mythology is that basically. Yeah, it's basically that, like, this is Brussels maintained this old style of brewing that dates back to, I mean, not only to the Middle Ages, but probably to the dawn of mankind, basically, and that they kept it up in Brussels and maintain it. But as I think we'll get to, it's actually a lot newer in Brussels. I mean, that there are still parts of the world where they brew traditionally like that and all, but as a big enterprise that kind of dominates not only Brussels but Belgium and now the world. I mean, spontaneous beers are becoming very popular. Brussels is kind of the one place where it's associated with that, because that's where they brewed like this, and it was the main beer of Brussels for a few centuries at least.
Yeah. Where to start? Well, basically, I think you can say that up until 1970, there wasn't any Lambic mythology around. Lambic just existed, and people drank it less and less by that time, but people did not think too much about its history. And then in the 1970s, some people started wondering about this. Where does this beer come from? What is its history? And also because there were some threats to Lambic at that point. It was getting to be an old people's beer in a way. It was less popular. All of Belgium started to drink Stella Artois and Jupiler. And people were really enthusiastic to preserve it, and they started asking themselves questions about its history. So that's the time when some people, tried to give Lambic in history, also with very noble motives, to promote and save this very special beer. But they did, because already in the 1970s, Lambic was a very special beer. It's for spontaneous fermentation, its use of wheat, its use of old hops, another one. So basically, anything that they found special in the 1970s, they sort of projected it on Lambic and projected it into the past.
Yeah.
And for instance, the usage of cool ships. Today we think that's typical of Lambic, but basically that's how all beers were cooled at some point before the late 19th century. Lambic has some wheat in it, but I can assure you that right into the 19th century, most beers had wheat in it, and oats and buckwheat and whatever, and it was very. You would be hard pressed to find a barley-only beer in the 17th or 18th century anywhere, at least in Belgium and in the Netherlands, and also beyond. So some characteristics of Lambic are, basically characteristic of an old-fashioned beer, but not specifically of Lambic. And actually, the fact that Lambic has only two types of cereal in it is actually rather modern.
Okay.
That's where a lot of those stories come from people trying to do the research, but researching only Lambic history, not beer history as a whole. And it has fulfilled its role. I mean, it did make the historical aspect did make people interested in the beer itself and in drinking it. But right now, as we learn more about beer history as a whole, we can also see where the flaws in this old narrative are.
Okay, so maybe we'll go to that. So, I mean, the first record of Lambic, if I remember your documentation right, is really from about the 1700s.
Yeah. So I'll try to do the short version. Also, at this point, I think I should mention the book by Ralph Meert. Okay. Ralph Meert is a guy from Belgium, from the Brussels area, who has published a book simply called Lambic, or Lambic, the Untamed Beer, if I quote it correctly. I'll just take a quick peek into my documentation. Okay. Yeah, Lambic, the Untamed Brussels Beer, Origin, Evolution, and Future, published in 2022.
Okay.
So Ralph Meert has been doing some research for some years now, as have I. Also, one of the reasons that I researched Lambic, because I was aware of Ralph's research, but he stopped publishing, so I just started researching some stuff myself. So I did find out some stuff myself, but also I will be mentioning some of his findings at some point. So basically, if you look at the history of beer in Brussels, you will find that before the 18th century, there was no Lambic or anything similar at all. They were just drinking, pretty normal beers for its time. Okay. So with several cereals, with very likely just added yeast to it as they would anywhere else. Because if you think about it, it's so much easier to brew with yeast by adding yeast, and brewers worldwide had already found that out, quite early on. And spontaneous brewing is the hard way, basically. It is so easy to take yeast from a fermenting beer and to reuse it in the next brew. So why wouldn't you?
Plus, you can manage your consistency as well.
Exactly, and you can sell your yeast to the bakers.
Yep.
Another book that is worth mentioning is the Historical Brewing Techniques by Lars Garshol from Norway, who has written about farmer brewers, especially in Scandinavia. And if you look at the ease with which these farmer brewers could store their yeast, so they didn't rely on spontaneous fermentation. They just stored their yeast and then reused it for their next brew at some point later on. So anyway, so the beers of Brussels in the beginning of the 18th century were pretty normal as far as we know. So with several grain types, some white beers, some brown beers. But then suddenly, at some point during the 18th century, you get a phenomenon called yellow beer. And the first of these yellow beers to surface in a text is Faro, actually. Faro is much older than Lambic. And at that time, you did not brew Lambic and then blend Faro from it. You just brewed Faro. So we get the first mention of a Faro in Brussels in 1721. Not really very well described, but we know at least that it was there. And then around the 1780s, you get the first mentions of Lambic, or alambic, as they would call it then.
Okay, and that comes from, I think you said that comes from Arabic, well, from French, from Arabic.
Yeah, so an alambic is a still, stuff for distilling gin or similar products. And they call it that way because Lambic, to those people, really resembled gin. It was a high alcohol beer. It was clear. It was yellow. So that the name probably comes from the fact that they sort of compared it to gin in some ways.
Yeah. Okay. And so at that point, we don't know what the beer was like, though, because Faro would have been completely different from what we have now.
Yeah, it probably would actually be a lot like today's Lambic, and then it evolved into something else. But that's the thing that you have to keep in mind, is that you get a beer that's called Faro, or at some point you get a beer called Lambic, but it's not necessarily the same as what we would think of such a beer with such a name today. And also it's defined differently, and also it means something differently. So by the time you get Lambic in the 1780s, probably it was a spontaneous beer, probably it was yellow, it was clear. Maybe it already was like 6 or 7% alcohol, but you have to keep in mind that with 6 or 7% alcohol for those days, that was really a heavy beer.
Right.
It was easily the heaviest beer that was around in Belgium at that point. So to them, it was like, this is a really heavy beer. And also because of the high alcohol content, easy to store. Also because it was so clear, it was also, so there was less proteins in it or whatever, so it was also easier to keep. And that's how it evolved. And actually, I think that spontaneous fermentation is also a way to get a high alcohol beer.
Okay.
With all the different yeasts that are around, they consume more sugar, and so you get more alcohol.
Okay, I never considered that side of it. For some reason, I'd always just assumed it would be the same. But now that you say it, yeah, if you have that mix of yeast and you have the bacteria in there as well, of course, which gives it the sourness, then yeah, maybe it. Yeah, I can see why it might be stronger.
And that's probably the reason why they devised this spontaneous fermentation in the first place, to get that particular beer, a clearer beer, good for keeping, and also with more alcohol. That's the effect that they were looking for. So that's why they devised spontaneous fermentation. And you shouldn't forget that Lambic wasn't the first spontaneously fermented beer in Belgium, because there was another spontaneously fermented beer that actually is still around, but you wouldn't look at it that way, because white beer from Hoegaarden, the 18th century, was also spontaneously fermented.
Okay.
A completely different beer, because they would, in Hoegaarden, which was a small village just as it is now, they would brew white beer, have it ferment spontaneously, and then drink it after 2 weeks or so.
Okay.
So they would not store it for a long time, or they wouldn't use it in a way that you would use Lambic, but it did have spontaneous fermentation. That may be where the brewers of Brussels got the idea.
Okay. So at this point we're talking about the idea that it's been there since the 12th century or something is non-existent. It came into being around the late 18th century.
A beer of the Enlightenment, really. And also, with a very special purpose to get a special, effect, a special kind of beer.
Right. But I mean, at that stage, obviously, there were no big commercial breweries, so you can't trace to which brewer started it or why it would spread or anything. We have no way of tracing it.
Actually, Ralph Meert got really close with his research. So, if I'm not mistaken, around the year 80 or 82, there was a brewery called the Newcomer.
Okay.
In what was it called? The Bruidstraat. I forgot the French name. Rue de la Fiancée. Okay. Somewhere in Brussels, and this, at least it was one of the first. The thing is with Ralph Meert's book is that it's really interesting and provides a lot of new insights, but he has a big flaw that he doesn't mention the sources.
Okay.
He will only say, I found this manuscript with all this fascinating stuff in it, and I won't tell you where it is.
Okay.
Thank you, Ralph. So I asked him about it, and he was really a bit evasive about it. So I do think that it exists. Why would he make it up? But real, actually, in historical research, you also have to provide evidence, and he doesn't do that. For I don't know, maybe he thinks that someone else will steal the show or whatever, which is a bit frustrating. But I think I do assume that all this stuff exists, and that he's just, I don't know, shy or anxious about it, that he won't show the evidence, because we would learn even more. Then I could also look at it and anyway, but yeah, so we can trace it to at least one brewer who was doing it at some point, and he, if I'm not mistaken, he did actually do a demonstration for the Brussels City Council or something about how this process worked. So it's all highly interesting stuff, and Raf really has uncovered some interesting sources there. It would be nice if he would share them with the world. But yeah, so you really can chase it,
Just
to almost one place, which is quite a feat. I mean, it's harder to say where Faro comes from, but Lambic we do have some clue by now.
Okay, and yeah, because I guess what I think of is, if someone started brewing this way, I mean, one of the defining things about Lambic is its sourness.
Yeah.
So I guess that. Yeah, there's two things. You can get it less sour if you don't let it ferment as long.
Yeah.
You don't, like you were saying, this was one of the stronger beers they had, which was its selling point. So it must have been sour, really. But maybe the strength overcame the sourness, because for anybody who's had a pure Lambic beer, that first taste is pretty much, whoa, what is this?
Yeah, it is really special and really good. And I mean, pure Lambic, you can just drink it like lemonade, really.
Yeah.
So highly recommend it if you're in the region to try that. So yeah, it probably was sour. Also, though, that's probably also the reason why they often would sweeten it at some point, because quite early on you get Lambic blenders. So people start blending Lambics. And also adding some sugar at some point, or selling. You get adverts selling sweet Lambic and a foaming Lambic and different types of Lambic. To get to serve the customers different Lambics as they were asking for. And that's probably also why Faro was sort of the weaker older brother of Lambic, and that's probably why it evolved in even weaker drink with more sugar, because there was a market for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that is probably a lot of people's way into Lambic, because I know when I first tried it, like the Faro was a bit better because it was sweeter. Now I can't handle the sweetness. The sweetness is way overpowering for me. But you try maybe then a Kriek, or you try a Gueuze, which is, to me, is the perfect one. Like the Gueuze it's not overly sour, it's not sweet, and it's sparkling. I mean, that to me is the perfect beer.
It really makes me thirsty,
Go ahead. I don't have any fire ahead.
I might as well just keep it away from the computer. Oops.
Okay, you're making me jealous.
If anybody's watching, this is the moment to open your bottle of Gueuze.
Yeah.
There we go.
And that is something there. I mean, that is, like I said, it's characteristic of Gueuze. It's this blend of old and new, because it's sparkling and it comes in a bottle.
Yeah.
But that is not how it was for most of its life.
Well, it's not how it started. So, in the right at this point, I can't really tell you at the top of my head where when Gueuze was first mentioned. It used to be 1829, maybe Raf found the date a bit earlier. But so it gets mentioned at some point. It really becomes popular at the end of the 19th century, when it already starts to look more like this. But in the beginning, actually, if we look at the sources, you can see that Gueuze was actually the unblended lambic.
Okay.
Lambic that you wouldn't blend and that you would keep in the barrels for as long as possible, and only then you would drink it. You could actually, it often wasn't put in bottles at all. You would just drink it from the barrel as you would with other beers. It would not be that much foamy because, it wasn't blended, so why would it foam? And often if it was put in bottles, it just was a better way to store it even longer. Because Raf Meert has made I think he made a good case that it is likely that Gueuze originally means raw. Okay. That's an old French word meaning raw, because Gueuze is also a word for raw iron.
Okay.
Oh, and this is like a raw beer. And Gueuze, I've seen articles about breweries in Brussels that maybe 5% of what they were making of their lambic was eligible to become Gueuze at some point, because Gueuze was the high quality variety that you would store longest and before you would drink it.
Right.
But that was all mid-19th century stuff.
I'm just thinking, I'm thinking more about the sourness and that in the lambic that would have been there then, if it's been around for a while.
Yeah.
And again, how you got over that sourness, because having talking to other people, sour always meant it's gone off, it's gone bad. So you had to. I wonder. I guess what I'm getting at is the lambic is sour, and most people wouldn't have wanted that, but they get the strong beer. And do we understand how it spread out and became popular to overcome that sourness? Or did it become seen as, because it was never seen as kind of a high class drink, was it? It was always kind of.
It was really the people's drink of Brussels. Yes. So it probably would have been drunk by all classes, but of course, right in the 18th and 19th century, you get other drinks that get popular, like coffee and tea. Wine was, of course, the rich people's drink, also in Belgium. But you mustn't forget that Lambic was not the only sour beer that was around. Okay. Sour beer had been a trend in the 18th century. You get old beer, old brown beer, as you would call it, at least over here in Holland. Then in the 19th century, you get other sour beers or keeping beers in Belgium and in the Netherlands, like Saison, which also was a sour beer, the Saison of Liège. And you mustn't forget that sour beer was also a trend in England, because the original porter was also a sour beer at some point. There was also a beer that you would store for a very, very long time in huge vats and barrels before you would also sell it and maybe blend it.
Okay.
But sour beer was already a trend, and Lambic was only one of those beers.
Okay. I suppose like you have your Berliner Weisses and stuff as well, but yeah. So maybe it's not. I don't know. For some reason, I got made like someone had mentioned to me that for most of history you stayed away from sour things because that meant they were gone off and they were just not good for you. Yeah,
but for beer that was not really a problem. Certainly not by the 18th and 19th century.
And once you get it like that, once we've seen it, like once you get a taste for the kind of the sour stuff, it is something that you kind of get almost more extreme on. I mean, my own palate has changed a lot over the last couple of years, drinking lambics and other spontaneous beers, and that like they're what I generally choose now. But my wife picks one up and I think this is lovely. My wife wants a taste and she just throws it away, like, does not want it. I know my palate has changed that. So I can see how if you're like you said, if it's around and if it's what you're growing up with, then that is what your palate is.
Throughout the centuries, you get different trends, really. So, in the 19th century, you get all those bottom fermented beers start being popular, which are, of course, are not sour, probably more bitter than the 20th century. You get this old wave of sweet beers, especially after the Second World War. Beers only get sweeter. Now we are going back more to bitter beers with IPAs, but also, lagers are also getting more bitter.
Yeah.
So it can vary and go all sorts of ways.
Yeah. There was something I was going to ask you there about. So the Gueuze, like you said, was the old beer, and it was sold in casks. It was sold in barrels, and it was just the tap was that
also in bottles. But
do we know when they started doing when it changed into, I don't know what the exact rules are now, but it's a mix. Is a 3-year-old and 1-year-old beers have to be combined. There's very strict instructions to what.
I don't think there are rules for when you have to blend the Gueuze. And that it's not defined by law. And you have law says it has to be spontaneously fermented. That you have to add wheat. But basically, Gueuze started evolving to a bottled blended beer with a lot of foam. I think near the end of the 19th century. Then that's really when Gueuze became popular, and when it evolved into. It was also a more luxury variant of the ordinary Lambic.
Okay.
So that if you can look at the prices, you also see that Lambic was rather affordable, but that Gueuze was more expensive. It's also at the end of the 19th century that you get the popularity of Kriek. Before that, it wasn't really a thing. You can find evidence of cherries in beers already in the 16th at least in the 17th and 18th century. But this is, of course, cherries in beers, and we're now talking about cherries in Lambic. And this Kriek only becomes popular at the end of the 19th century, of course, and then it never went away.
Yeah, I always found that interesting. Why Kriek? I mean, there's lots of other fruits, and there's lots of other. I mean, you do get other fruited lambics as well, but Kriek has its own kind of its own category. Which do we know why that is very much its own category?
Probably because, probably cherries are. I mean, the original cherry used was the cherry of Schaarbeek. It's like today it's a suburb of Brussels, and you'd be hard pressed to find any tree there. It's one of the most urbanized places in Belgium, but it used to be a place with a lot of orchards, and it had its own type of sour cherry. And so we do find evidence of those cherries being used in beers at some point, and then at some point they get popular in Lambic. So it's probably a combination of availability, and that it's lends itself very easily to being used in a Lambic, and that for the taste effect that it provides. So today the Schaarbeek Kriek was almost died out, but it's making a small comeback. But today they just use sour cherries from other regions of Belgium or beyond.
Okay. Depending on
which Kriek you're buying.
And that brings us, I suppose, to the whole fact of what like you mentioned, there is no law on Gueuze and stuff. So what is the categorization of Lambic? Sorry, I'm jumping forward a little bit here.
Yeah, that's all right.
Categorization of Lambic, because I have never quite figured out it. Is it it's a protected term, but it seems to be, if it's only within the, Pajottenland land, but then that doesn't apply somewhere. I cannot figure out.
It's not limited geographically. Okay. So it's only so it's a guaranteed traditional specialty, if I'm saying this correctly, but it is not limited to any place. Okay. Traditionally, of course, it comes. If you look at where it was made, it started out in the city of Brussels, but in the 19th century, Brussels was really restructured a lot. If you would have gone to Brussels in around 1800 or so, you would have looked around, it would have looked a lot like Bruges, really, really nice old place. But then halfway the 19th century, it was the new capital of Belgium, a new country, so they decided, let's make it look like Paris.
Yeah.
So they changed a lot, and during that process, a lot of the breweries left the city. They just stopped or started brewing in the suburbs, or evolved into bigger breweries, also making other types of beer. And that's when the brewers in the countryside around Brussels took over.
Okay.
Where most of the Lambic brewers of the region are now. So in the Boyotte land, as you mentioned, or in the Seine Valley. But to be honest with you, very early on they started imitating Lambic elsewhere. So I've seen proof of Lambic being brewed as far as Utrecht in 1812 in the Netherlands. It's actually north of the place where I am right now. Okay. So the Dutch discovered Lambics in 1810, and around that time or so. Also because a shortage of coffee and tea, so they were started to drink more beer because of the Napoleonic Wars. Anyway, so they started imitating Lambic in Holland, and actually the Netherlands have been brewing Lambics from 1810 or so until the 1930s.
Okay.
So actually in my hometown, Gorkum, they would make a Faro up until at least the end of the 19th century. I've seen brewing records of Faro and Lambic in Haarlem from 1820. So really, those are the oldest Lambic brewing records I've seen anywhere.
Okay.
Ralph Meert has seen older ones, but I can't tell you where they are because he hadn't told me or anyone else. But so the Dutch started imitating Lambic with some degree of success, and from then on, it only shows you that you basically, if you know how to do it, you can brew a Lambic anywhere, and officially you can.
Okay.
Because no law is stopping you from doing it. Yep. Of course, it's clear that the Lambic really is from the Brussels area, and that's where the really traditional breweries are, and also the best, in my humble opinion. But if you wanted, you could make a Lambic in Ireland, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I know people who are making spontaneous beers, but I don't think anyone is calling it Lambic. But
it's out of respect more than. But there was a guy in north of the Netherlands, in the province of Drenthe or Groningen, I don't know, and he just called it Gueuze or Lambic, and it was actually quite good. Toon van the Book. I'm not sure if he's still doing it. But most people, out of sort of respect for the original ones, don't call it that way, which I understand.
Yeah, no, but that's why I was never 100% clear what the rules were on it,
Yeah, but so there are some rules. Also, if Toon van the Broek wants to brew a Lambic in Groningen, he still has to abide by 30% wheat, spontaneous fermentation, if he wants it to call it a Gueuze or Lambic.
Okay, so that the ingredients are.
That's for everywhere in Europe. Those rules apply.
Okay. So then the Pajottenland land part then is just that's where the originals, well, not the originals, but the second wave were when Brussels changed.
Yeah,
that was the thing I remember reading. I think it was Frank Boone said it. That he saw Lambic not so much about the yeast and the method, but about the wheat and about the land, that it was very much a terroir of the ingredients.
Well, you would have to judge the taste to judge that. The process of doing it can be emulated elsewhere. If it tastes the same, that's up to you. But it's clear that the know-how of how to do it, that's still very much in that region. That's the tradition and also the old brewery buildings. I mean, if you go to a place like Timmermans or the Trog or someone, they really those are breweries or Cantillon. Those are really old breweries that have been going on for several centuries. And they're like historical monuments, and they still brew beer, and they're absolutely fantastic places.
Yeah, I've been to Cantillon. It's a number of years ago now, but yeah, it was an experience.
Yeah, it is. So you know, why brew it elsewhere if the real thing is so fantastic?
Yeah, so I mean, it became, like I said, it went from the 18th century, started out somewhere in the 80s, it then came and it just dominated Brussels. It became the beer in Brussels and took over everything. When did it start to decline then again?
Well, I would say like the end of the 19th century, you get all these bottom fermented beers start being popular. Also in Belgium at some point, and that's when it starts declining. It also after First World War, you also get a shift from Lambic to Gueuze.
Okay.
So the price difference between Lambic and Gueuze was not so large anymore. So people started drinking Gueuze because it was not that much more expensive. So that's when it shifted to Gueuze. But the change of the public, with the taste changed, and so I think at least from the beginning of the 20th century, it started shifting towards more modern beers, and then you get also that the lambics or the Gueuzes themselves started to change, especially after the Second World War. They get a lot sweeter. Okay. You get like these commercial Gueuzes, which are in the ordinary bottles with the crown cork, as you call it, and they are a lot sweeter. They're made in quite an industrial way, and all the traditional ones are slowly declining. And so, but you get the situation that around the 1970s that the country is dominated by all the big lager brewers like Artois and Jupiler. And it's only in the 1970s that you get, people get interested in more traditional beers. So there were some other very nice local specialties around, of course, in Belgium, specialty beers, the old browns of Flanders, or the last saisons that were still around in the Hainaut province, or Pierre Celis started to brew Hoogaarder white beer again, and all that other stuff. And that's you also get some revival of Gueuze, but it was still declining right until the 1990s.
Okay, because my first visit to Brussels, would have been around 2000 or something. So but Gueuze was everywhere. So it came back very rapidly.
Yeah, so a lot of people have done some very good work in promoting and saving it, and they've done a wonderful job, because it's the sort of thing that if this beer would have died out today, we would have actually no clue of what it would have tasted like.
Yeah.
You would read about it and you would think, sounds interesting, but you really have to drink it to get a clue of, this is what this stuff should taste like.
Yeah, and I mean that was, like you said, it was down to just a handful of people. I mean, Cantillon, Boone, and just
like 10 brewers or so, or 10 breweries and blenders together, still doing that.
Yeah, and were the ones at that time, because at one point it was all, like I said, it was seen, that there was no single source as far as I know. Like, they were taking wort from different brewers and different, like I said, blending, and it's kind of gradually moved. There's a lot of single source now, where they're, it's a single farm or a single person. So has that changed much, or?
Yeah, I wouldn't be the right person to touch about it. You get some new players. I mean, Frank Boon, as a young man, he took over an old Lambic blender or brewery. I'm not sure. You would have to ask Frank himself, perhaps. But it was very special that I managed to do that. Same with the Cantillon, and the idea of turning it into a museum and give it a new life. They really done a wonderful job.
Yeah, and I mean they set up then the Horal, which is, I guess, coming the full circle then to where we were at the start. I mean, that was to help promote it, to help keep it going. That they kind of built up the mythology around it being a really ancient.
Yeah.
But it's actually far more interesting because, like, the way that an old brewing technique becomes new again, gets reintroduced, and then kind of takes over the whole city it's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, and the thing is that if you, I have that a lot with beer history, and you look at certain beer styles and they tell you a certain story about it, and you're just like, if you think about it, it just never makes sense. I mean, why would you always have spontaneously fermented beers? It's not practical. Why would they do that? So usually when you start looking into that, you start to realize, oh no, the story is completely different. And spontaneous fermentation has another background and another reason why they do it. And suddenly it does start to make sense. That's all things that the real history tells you so much more about what was going on, and makes much more sense. It's also, it's supported by the evidence. So I was just talking about Ralph Meer's book that doesn't provide some sources, but I've seen other sources which really confirm the things that Ralph has found. So I think he's on the right track there.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to have to get hold of that book because I haven't. But I mean, so what the story is really is that Lambic, rather than being something that just kept going, I mean, they were pioneers. These were pioneering breweries who introduced a whole new way of brewing and a whole new taste of beer to the city.
Yeah, the thing, if you do not know too much about it, so they did devise a new kind of beer, but they were probably also building on knowledge and traditions established elsewhere. But they did turn it into something quite unique.
Yeah, and there's nowhere else that you know of, is there, that where it became the people's drink? It became the drink everybody drank. Some sort of
Lambic. That Lambic was really the people's drink of Brussels. Yeah. In Western Flanders or Eastern Flanders, in Flanders you get the old brown beers, or
really nice ones.
Red beers. That's also, but they are slightly newer. It's very hard to trace them back anywhere else before the late 19th century.
Okay.
But who knows what we will find about those?
Yeah. Well, I guess that's a story for another day. Yeah, but hopefully, if you have been to Brussels, maybe you've tasted them. If not, I mean, when you're in Brussels, then someone should try them. I mean, you do have Lambic bars. You still have Alabicasse is still there, I think, with its own Lambic, and there's a few like that. Alabicasse. I pronounce it all wrong.
I suppose it's still there. It should be.
I think it is anyway. The last time I was there, it was. And that they have their own Lambic in the little jugs, and it's.
Yeah, or on the countryside, of course, you've got this other legendary pub in the Verzekering tegen de Grote Dorst. The
Okay.
insurance against the big thirst.
Okay.
Only open on Sundays, but that's also highly recommended. You should just go, if you're watching this, go to Brussels, and go to Belgium and have a look around the entire country. But especially, it's a weird city, Brussels. Really, it's a weird place, but it's there for you to discover.
Yeah. Excellent. Listen, Roel, thanks a million. I don't know how much you've gone through your Gueuze there, but hopefully got a good bit. Not doing too bad.
So the good thing about those bottles that they're quite large.
Yeah, and like you said, they used. Actually, that you did have a good story. I remember that when they first started doing it in bottles, they all exploded or something. There was a huge explosion in some place.
Yeah, well, the danger was when you get a really hot summer.
Yeah.
And then when your cellars start getting hot, then you're in trouble. They had the same troubles in the Champagne area, by the way, in France, with Champagne, of course. Is that if your summers get really hot and your bottles get too warm, then you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's why they're stronger bottles.
Yeah, so at some point they were also simply using champagne bottles in Brussels for Lambic.
Okay.
For that very reason.
Oh, I didn't know that. So anyway, like I said, I'm going to let you go because you've been very generous with your time. I'll just put up here, actually, for anybody who wants to check out more your website, I'm going to run along here. It's lostbeers.com.
Yes.
Well worth checking out. And you can see the books, which are, like you said, only in Dutch, are listed there as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was fascinating. Like I said, it's an even more fascinating and maybe almost a more romantic story than the one they actually tell, because you can trace where it's coming from and how people pioneered it rather than it just being something that stuck around.
Yeah. That's the whole thing. It's like the history of any beer style. Also, the history of Lambic and Gueuze is a history of change, really.
Yeah.
And adaptation and innovation, and nothing ever stays the same. That's a constant that you always get, also in beer history.
Excellent. Listen, as I said, thanks again. Hopefully I'll have this up soon. And thanks to everybody who will be watching this in time. Roel's been, like I said, check out lostbeers.com. He has a whole history. You can dig into the history of beers in Belgium and in the Netherlands. Basically, that's the main focus.
Yeah.
And, you'll also find them if you speak Dutch, or maybe you.
There's also a Dutch version of the website, but you'll find it there.
Okay. So, like I said, I've said thank you about 4 times now, so I'm going to say it once more. And I really enjoyed this, and it's been very informative. So
okay. Well, you're welcome. See you another time, perhaps.
Yes, excellent. I saw that you have a book on Bock. Maybe we can talk about that sometime.
Yeah, in the autumn.
Excellent. We'll plan
Bock season.
Excellent. Okay. So thanks a million.
Cheers.
Bye.